July the 18th, Portland Communications will released its fourth How Africa Tweets study. This year's study analyzed thousands of Twitter handles to determine the location and profession of the most influential voices driving Twitter conversations during 10 recent African elections. A key finding from the report is that bots and accounts displaying machine-like behavior were active across all the elections. In Kenya, bots accounted for 25% of influential voices. Rwanda was the opposite, with bots accounting for just 4% of influential voices. Across all elections, bots served primarily to agitate, pushing negative narratives about major issues, candidates, and perceived electoral abnormalities. Now, following the elections, many bots had the elections content removed, with some turning their attention to discussions outside Africa. For more on How Africa Tweets reports, Robert Watkinson, Portland's Africa partner, joins me live via Skype from London. Good evening, Robert.
Good evening, Vincent.
So if you can briefly just give us a little background to this, what led your curiosity into this direction?
Thank you. Yes, as you say, this is our fourth study, How Africa Tweets, looking at how Twitter is used on the continent. And some of the previous studies have looked at the volume of tweets, languages used, the time of day that people tweet. But this year we decided to interrogate an area that hadn't been looked at before by anyone, as far as we understand, which is how Twitter is being used around elections in Africa.
And then we look at the level to which it influenced, for example, Kenyan elections. Talk about 25%. Why would that be the case in Kenya? Who was tweeting? Who are people paying attention to?
Well, let me just take you back up a step and tell you a little bit more about the overall key findings of the report, if I may, before talking specifically about Kenya, because as you say, Kenya is a particularly interesting example. But obviously, across 9 different countries and 10 elections, there were 2 elections in Kenya during the period in question. You're talking about a very varied landscape. But we did identify some key findings which seem to exist across the board. The first is the prevalence of external voices. We found that about 53% on average across the elections of the most influential voices on Twitter around election campaigns were actually outside the countries in question. And when we dug deeper into that finding, we realized that actually about half of those influential voices were outside the continent itself. The second key finding, which I think is particularly interesting, is the influence of politicians and political parties during campaigns. We expected that to be quite high, but on average, we found actually that political voices account for about 10% of the influential tweeters during election campaigns. There are obviously anomalies, and in some cases, particularly in Rwanda, for example, we found political voices to be predominant. And then just to your populations, Kenya having about 50 million people compared to Rwanda's 12. What things that we found were different were the prevalence of bots in the Kenyan election campaigns. Bots accounted for about 25% of the most influential voices, whereas in Rwanda, they were around 4%. We also found that domestic voices were probably about the same in Kenya and Rwanda, at around 75%. So there is a real contrast there between the activity of bots in Rwanda and Kenya.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Robert, for joining us. We'll probably continue this conversation another time. That is Robert Watkinson of Portland Communications, and that's our show for today.